Okay, let's unpack this. There's this widely accepted, almost passively accepted idea, that homelessness in our big cities is just, it's too complicated, too vast, too intractable to ever really solve.
It's the standard narrative, isn't it? I mean, every city, whether it's a global hub or a smaller regional center, they all seem to land on the same conclusion. We can manage the crisis, but we can't end it.
But our deep dive into these sources, and we're talking major policy reports, cost-benefit studies from the Urban Institute, Brookings, the ASU Morrison Institute, UNM, it shows that conclusion isn't just lazy. It is actively, demonstrably untrue. The data is. It's overwhelming.
It is. The reality is that this crisis isn't complicated. It's layered. And every single one of those layers was built by very specific systemic and policy choices over, the last 50 years or so.
And what's fascinating, or maybe infuriating, is the sheer scale of investment in failure. When a problem gets this big, with this much money orbiting it, and we're talking billions a year on crisis response, on enforcement, on temporary shelters, it stops being an accidental failure.
Yeah. Exactly. It becomes a system. Structurally, it becomes a system that's designed to produce that exact outcome. It's optimized for management, not for resolution.
So our mission for you, the listener, is not to moralize here. We're going to analyze the specific economic and policy decisions that led to what the data shows is an architecture of fragility. We're going to expose the perverse financial and political incentives that funnel money toward managing human suffering instead of permanent, proven, and honestly, cheaper solutions. We're moving this from empathy to economics.
And we are approaching this strictly through that lens. Systems, incentives, hard economics using the data from these studies. And we have to emphasize one thing right at the top. The data exists. We can quantify the precise cost of leaving someone on the street versus housing them. So the persistence of the problem, it's not about ignorance. It's not that we don't know what to do. It's a measure of the outcome we've collectively decided to tolerate.
So how did it start? I mean, homelessness didn't just explode because people suddenly became less responsible. The crisis grew because the very foundation of stability, that architecture of fragility, it quietly broke across three critical areas: housing, mental health care, and wages.
Right. Think of it like a three-legged stool. If one leg breaks, you're in trouble. But if all three weaken at the same time, a collapse isn't just possible, it's guaranteed. And that's what happened.
This simultaneous fracturing, that's the key.
It is. It shifted all the risk onto the individual while yanking away the safety nets designed to catch them. Let's start with the biggest one, the most fundamental failure: housing. We've seen this global systemic shift, and UN reports highlight this, of housing moving from being shelter a core human need to becoming an asset class.
So it stopped being a home first, and it became an investment vehicle first. That's a subtle change in language, but a catastrophic change in priority.
Catastrophic is the right word. We're talking about staggering numbers here. Globally, residential real estate is now valued at something like 163 trillion US dollars.
Wait, 163 trillion?
Trillion, with a T. For context, that's more than twice the entire world's total annual GDP. When you flood a market with that much global capital, the housing stock, the very thing people need to survive, is no longer optimized for affordability or even occupancy. It's optimized for maximum return on investment.
And what does that mean on the ground? What are the policy consequences when you optimize a necessity for asset growth?
Well, it means turnover becomes profitable, right? The more you can turn over a unit, the more you can raise the rent. Rent maximization is the goal, which pushes out long-term tenants. And this is the really wild part: vacancy becomes acceptable. It's sometimes even desirable if it keeps supply tight and props up prices for asset holders.
So governments, even if they want to fulfill their human rights obligations to shelter people, they end up being more accountable to investors than to their own citizens.
That's the bind they're in. And you see the immediate result of this in the housing supply. In the U.S., you get this massive physical affordability gap. The Urban Institute details this. There's a shortage of 7.3 million affordable and available homes for extremely low-income renters.
7.3 million.
Let's just pause on that number because it's hard to really wrap your head around. That is a permanent displacement of people, equivalent to combining the entire populations of Philadelphia, Phoenix, and San Antonio, and then multiplying that by 2.
Wow. And these aren't just people looking for a bargain. Who qualifies as extremely low income?
They're people with incomes at or below 30% of the area median income. So for a family of 4 in a lot of cities, you're talking less than $35,000 a year.
And that shortage, that 7.3 million gap, That's the hole in the system. It means when someone has a crisis, they lose a job, they get sick, they flee domestic violence, there is literally no affordable unit for them to land in.
There's no exit. And the data on who can even access the private market is horrifying. A person working a full-time federal minimum wage job cannot afford a simple one-bedroom rental at fair market rate in 93% of U.S. counties.
93%. So the private market is, by design, not for the working poor.
It's structurally set up to exclude them,
Yeah.
and that's just the first broken leg of the stool. Let's talk about the second, mental health care. The process of deinstitutionalization, back in the 60s and 70s, it started with a really humane intent. The goal was to close these massive, often abusive state institutions.
Right. But the execution was incomplete, to put it mildly.
Disastrously incomplete. We closed the old institutions, but we never built the replacement. We never funded the community-based care facilities, the psychiatric beds that were needed to treat people with severe chronic mental illness at scale.
Yeah.
The money it never showed up.
And that gap was filled by what?
The default systems, emergency rooms, the criminal justice system, and eventually sidewalks and parks. I mean, look at the data from the Vera Institute of Justice. This is genuinely shocking. Chicago's Cook County Jail, the LA County Jail, and New York's Rikers Island. Each of those jails holds more people with serious mental health conditions than any dedicated treatment facility in the entire country.
Wait, hold on. So the three biggest mental health facilities in the United States are jails. That seems like the literal definition of a systemic failure.
It absolutely is. We've substituted enforcement for treatment, and this has lethal consequences. Police become the first responders for mental health crises, and they're put in these impossible situations they are not trained for. The research is tragic. It shows police are more likely to shoot and kill black men who are showing signs of a mental health condition than white men with similar behaviors. The failure to fund community care literally gets people killed.
And all this despite the fact that these conditions, schizophrenia, severe depression, bipolar disorder, they're treatable.
They are. The ASU Morrison Institute study stressed this. Stability is the single most important factor for treatment to be successful. But the system we've built prioritizes crisis response jails, ERs over stability. We wait for rock bottom, spend a fortune to manage the immediate crisis, and then release them right back into the same instability that caused it.
And that brings us to the third fracture, the third leg of the stool, wages and labor.
This one is more insidious because it wasn't a sudden collapse. Wages didn't just fall off a cliff, they just stagnated. They decoupled from productivity, while the cost of everything else, especially housing and healthcare, just exploded.
So the result, like you said, is the margin for error just vanished for millions of people. You don't need to lose your job to become homeless anymore.
Exactly. A $500 car repair. An unexpected medical bill. That's not an inconvenience anymore. For a family hovering just above that poverty line, that one shock is catastrophic. They can't absorb it, they miss rent, they get evicted, and because of that 7.3 million unit housing shortage, there's nowhere to go.
And we saw this happen in real time when the last of the pandemic safety nets were pulled away. The data from KFF is crystal clear. The end of the eviction moratorium, the enhanced unemployment benefits, when that ended, it directly drove a sharp 18% increase in total homelessness between 2023 and 2024.
That is the sound of the bottom falling out. And what's really alarming is the impact on kids. The number of children experiencing homelessness grew at double the rate of adults in that same period. A 33% increase for kids versus 15% for adults. We are talking about a systemic pipeline for childhood trauma.
So when you look at them together, none of these decisions felt cruel on their own. Closing institutions was meant to be humane. Treating housing like an asset was just economic progress. But together, this architecture of fragility, it became lethal. It created a system where stability is fundamentally impossible to maintain for millions of people.
Right. And when a system produces outcomes we don't like visible suffering on our streets, what do? As a society, we invent stories. We invent these convenient narratives about the people stuck inside the problem.
It's a psychological shield, right? It lets us stay comfortable and shift the blame from the system's choices onto the individual's character. It's their fault, not our fault.
Exactly. So let's address the top 3 myths using hard data, especially from studies on really vulnerable groups like disconnected youth, because their situation makes the cause and effect so clear. Myth number 1, the big one. Most homeless people don't work. It frames the whole thing as a choice, a failure of character.
Laziness, lack of ambition, rather than a failure of the economic architecture. But the data just doesn't support that. It's about a shock, not a lack of effort. Many people experiencing homelessness are working part-time, seasonal jobs that just don't pay enough.
Let's look at that study of homeless youth in Columbus, Ohio. This is a tough group to serve.
Hmm.
Under 24, homeless for months, they avoid the adult services system. At the start of the study, yeah, their unemployment was high. 62% were still unemployed after 9 months.
So if you stop reading there, the myth looks true.
Right. But that misses the whole point of the intervention they used, this strengths-based outreach and advocacy. It was all about stabilizing their immediate needs and connecting them with a supportive adult, and the economic shift was profound. It didn't instantly get them all full-time jobs, but it dramatically changed where their money came from.
Okay, how so?
Over the course of the study, they saw a big increase in income from legal sources, so paid work, help from family, government benefits. But here's the kicker. They saw a massive $607 reduction in quarterly income from what the study calls survival behaviors.
And survival behaviors are
It's
the
just-
dangerous stuff.
Exactly. Panhandling, theft, selling drugs, sex work. A nearly $600 drop in income from those sources per quarter is huge. It proved that when you connect them with an advocate who helps them cut through the red tape, get an ID, access benefits, they move toward legal income.
So the barrier wasn't a lack of will to work. It was the impossibility of getting a job without an address or an ID or a phone.
Precisely. The data showed that improved housing stability directly led to higher odds of getting a job. Housing comes first. It's a precondition for stability, not a reward for it.
Which leads right into the second myth, the idea that it's mainly addiction. This lets us off the hook by framing it as a medical problem or a moral failure instead of an economic one.
And we have to be really clear here. Addiction is real. Substance use disorders are devastating. But the sources consistently showed that the causality is often flipped. Substance use frequently follows homelessness. It's a coping mechanism for the trauma, the cold, the fear, rather than the thing that caused the housing loss in the first place.
Instability amplifies the behavior.
It amplifies it. It doesn't invent it.
Yeah.
And that Columbus Youth study gives us crucial data on this. They found that when mental health improved, less depression, less anxiety, the income from those high-risk survival behaviors dropped significantly.
So when the distress goes down, the reliance on high-risk coping, which often includes substance use, also goes down.
The connection is undeniable. And that's the whole philosophy behind Housing First. If you give someone a stable foundation, everything else, including treatment for addiction or mental illness, has a chance to work. The ASU Lighthouse Homes are a perfect example. They provide housing to people with chronic mental illness with no preconditions. They don't evict tenants for a relapse because they know recovery isn't a straight line.
And eviction just guarantees a return to chaos and high-cost crisis care.
And the nuance in the youth studies data on drug use is really telling. They found that polydrug use, using multiple substances, was strongly linked to getting income from illegal survival behaviors. But increased marijuana use was actually associated with increased income from legal sources, like employment.
That's a huge distinction. It suggests some substances are tied to the chaos of survival crime, while others might be used to self-medicate just to function enough to hold down a job. It really complicates that simple narrative.
Immensely. Which brings us to the third myth, the magnet myth. They're all outsiders who moved here for our generous services. This one is so convenient for local politicians because it lets them deny any local responsibility.
It's our broken housing market. No, it's the outsiders draining our resources. But the data on this is so consistent across the country. It just refutes this honeypot effect entirely.
Let's run through the numbers. Asheville, North Carolina. 71% of people experiencing homelessness last one had stable housing right there in the local county. Seattle, King County. 83% were living locally when they lost their housing. They were your neighbors.
And what about San Francisco? That's always the city people point to.
Even in San Francisco, the numbers hold.
Yeah.
70% were living in the city when they became homeless. And of that group, more than half had lived there for 10 years or more.
So they didn't arrive broken. They were established members of the community who just fell through the floor.
They fell through that architecture of fragility we talked about. And an Australian study confirms this is a global pattern. People move because of negative reasons, eviction, violence, and they move short distances. They are not migrating across the country for services. Homelessness is born from local economic conditions. Full stop.
So the takeaway here is pretty clear. Homelessness isn't some different category of person. It's a predictable outcome of broken systems. And the stories we tell are just a way to avoid looking at those systems.
Okay, so this is where it gets really uncomfortable for the people who say we just can't afford to solve this. Because we have known for years, based on solid peer-reviewed economic research, that the humane choice providing housing is also the financially sound, cost-saving choice.
This is the number we avoid. We have to repeat this because it's the core finding. It costs less to house someone than to leave them homeless. So the persistence of this problem isn't about a lack of money. It's about a failure to apply what we already know works. Let's start with the most expensive group to manage: people with chronic mental illness or CMI. These are the folks cycling through the high-cost systems, ERs, jails, crisis centers. The ASU Morrison Institute study in Arizona quantified these costs.
Right. They track people with CMI and compare the public costs for three groups: the chronically homeless, those in unknown housing, and those in permanent supportive housing, or PSH. And PSH, to be clear, is stable housing combined with wraparound services, case management, healthcare, counseling, no preconditions.
And the data. It's just a devastating indictment of our current approach. The average annual public cost for a person with CMI who is chronically homeless is, what was the number?
It's about $73,000
Hmm.
per person per year. That's police, courts, ambulances, hospital stays.
Okay, 73,000. Now compare that to the cost for a person in permanent supportive housing.
The cost drops to $52,000.
So that's a saving of $21,000 per person per year. A 29% reduction in public spending just by housing them.
And we know exactly where those savings come from. For the homeless individual, about 75% of that $73,000 cost is just health care, crisis care, in ERs, behavioral health interventions. Housing immediately reduces those crisis events.
And their contact with the justice system goes down too.
Significantly. The average annual criminal justice cost for a homeless person with CMI is over $5,000. In PSH, that drops by almost half. The humane choice saves money by stopping the expensive cycle of crisis and incarceration.
And we see this exact same principle in every study of the Housing First model.
Every single one.
Yeah.
The Albuquerque Heading Home Initiative, which UNM analyzed, is a great example. They tracked all the public costs over a few years. They found that the participants cost the city about $1 million less overall during the study.
$1 million.
It averaged out to $14,700 saved per person. And here's the headline number. They got a return of $1.78 for every dollar they spent on the program, a 178% ROI. If that were any other public project, we'd call it a massive success.
In Los Angeles, the Economic Roundtable found a 79% reduction in public costs for chronically homeless individuals in supportive housing. Their monthly public costs went from almost $2,900 when homeless to just $600 once they were housed.
And again, it's about healthcare. PSH reduces ER visits by 61% and inpatient hospitalizations by 77%. Homelessness is the public health crisis. Housing is the cure for the spending.
Let's use the New York City analysis just to put a fine point on it. This compares the public cost for one person over 30 days. The numbers are just absurd.
Let's sit with them. This is the final ledger of the choice we're making. Costliest outcome: hospitalization. A 30-day hospital stay for an illness made worse by living on the street costs the public $108,270.
$108,000. Okay. Next, managing them through jail.
30 days of incarceration at Rikers Island. $42,420.
And a temporary bed in a shelter.
That costs $4,080 for the month.
Okay, now the investment in a real solution: supportive housing.
Just $2,040 for 30 days.
The comparison is just. It's staggering. We will spend over $100,000 on a hospital bed or $42,000 to jail someone instead of $2,000 to just house them. That's a 50-fold cost increase to manage the problem with jail instead of solving it with housing.
And this math is what drives effective programs like New York's FEWC initiative, which targets those frequent users of crisis systems. By prioritizing housing for them, they cut jail time by 40%, an average of 95 fewer days in jail per person.
The economic conclusion is just irrefutable. We know what works, and we know it saves money. So the choice to keep managing the problem at high cost it's a systemic preference. It's not a financial necessity. So if the math is so clear, we have to look at the incentive trap. Why do policy and funding keep steering us away from the cost-effective solution and toward this expensive perpetual management?
You have to look at the systems. I mean, cities and elected officials operate on political and visual incentives, and those rarely line up with long-term systemic solutions. Mayors and city councils, they get rewarded for dealing with visible suffering quickly, especially in downtown business districts.
Right. Clearing an encampment, doing a sweep, it looks like decisive action and satisfies the loudest complaints. And it gives you a good photo op that fits neatly into an election cycle. Housing takes time.
Exactly. And the Brookings research points out the absurdity of this focus on visibility. They found that in cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, the actual number of unsheltered people had either declined or stayed steady over the last decade. But public perception, fueled by media, was that it had exploded. And that perception drove policy, not the data.
And that focus on clearing encampments leads right into this counterproductive cycle of criminalization.
It does. You give someone fines they can't pay, you arrest them for sleeping in public. These things heap criminal records onto people, which then creates massive barriers to exiting homelessness.
A minor criminal record can disqualify you from housing and jobs. So the city spends money to arrest someone for being homeless, which then makes it impossible for them to not be homeless. It's self-sabotage. And the data shows police are deeply involved in these policies.
78% of mayors surveyed said police influence their homelessness policy. 59% enforce these quality of life charges. It's using the most expensive punitive tool we have, jails, to solve a housing problem.
And this just happens because the enforcement system is already there. It's already paid for. It's just inertia.
It's bureaucratic inertia choosing the path of least resistance. But there are proven alternatives. Denver's STAR program, based on the Cahoots model from Oregon, is a great example. They divert nonviolent 911 calls involving mental health or homelessness to specialists and paramedics, not armed police. It's better for everyone. It de-escalates situations and frees up police.
We also have to talk about the jail to homelessness pipeline. People get released from prison and go straight to a shelter or the street.
It's a huge problem. In New York, over half of people released from state prison go directly into the shelter system. But programs are trying to combat this. Cuyahoga County, Ohio, has a plan to build housing specifically for people with criminal backgrounds. Houston has a jail in-reach program that connects people to housing and services before they're even released.
Okay, so let's look at the highest level. The federal funding framework, the Continuum of Care program. It's well-intentioned, but it seems to promote continuity over disruption.
Right. This program funnels most federal homeless grants. It's highly technical, highly regulated. The rules often end up rewarding the renewal of existing management programs. Rather than bold shifts toward purely housing-focused solutions, it favors established providers.
And this creates this weird regional misalignment of incentives, the so-called migration problem.
This is a really crucial point. For single adults, the data shows that more generous federal funding for services works. It reduces unsheltered homelessness without creating a magnet effect. People don't move cross-country for a different sidewalk.
But it's different for families.
It's completely different for families. Communities that offer more generous, locally funded safety nets for families, like guaranteed shelter, they actually see larger family homeless populations. Because families facing the danger of instability for their kids will move to find a bed.
So this creates a perverse incentive for cities to underprovide for families.
Exactly. It's a regional trap. Local governments don't want to carry the entire regional burden, so they're incentivized to do less. The system rewards local self-preservation over regional collaboration.
The incentive trap is clear. A solved problem has no budget. A managed problem have an annual regulated funding stream. The system is structurally wired for persistence. We've laid out the economic costs, the systemic failures, the bad incentives, but the longest lasting cost of this is societal. It's the slow, insidious change in what we accept as normal, the erosion of what it means to be treated as a full person.
That erosion of humanity, that's the real price. For those who experience it, especially the young people in that Columbus study, the trauma is continuous. They're forced into these dangerous survival behaviors, trading their safety and dignity just to get by.
And the key to breaking that cycle, the study found, was advocacy. Just the simple act of connecting them with a supportive adult who helped them navigate the system.
It wasn't just about the benefits. It suggests that when you restore someone's dignity, when you treat them as a person with goals and not just a problem to be policed, that's what helps them move towards self-sufficiency. If the system only sees you as an obstacle on the sidewalk, you start to internalize that.
And think about the non-monetary costs. The system values the cost of cleaning an encampment over the cost of the trauma inflicted on someone whose only possessions are being thrown in a garbage truck. That sends a very clear message about whose humanity matters.
And that leads, inevitably, to the normalization of suffering for everyone else. Once we can step over someone on the sidewalk without a second thought, our society's standards have recalibrated downward. Instability becomes background noise. Displacement becomes expected. Empathy becomes conditional.
And that tolerance spreads. The Brookings analysis warns this creates a doom loop. The problem gets harder to solve the longer we wait because the political will, the civic mood, it all just spirals downward.
The damage is profound, not just to the individual, but to our public institutions, which are clogged with preventable crises, and to the civic fabric itself. We lose our shared sense of decency.
The path forward, according to all these sources, is a dual commitment. First, we have to aggressively increase the supply of all kinds of housing, especially deeply affordable housing. Second, we have to leverage the targeted federal funds that prioritize housing over management. We saw during the pandemic things like the emergency housing vouchers. They worked. They prevented massive spikes in homelessness when they were actually used.
The money works when the system is allowed to do what the data says works. And that's really the synthesis of this whole deep dive. Housing is cost-effective. The magnet myth is a political tool to deny accountability. The barriers are structural, not moral. And our systems are currently built to manage chaos, not end it. Which really raises an important question.
The persistence of homelessness is not a measure of our failure to understand the problem. The studies are there. The math is clear. Instead, it's a measure of our political and societal decision about what level of visible human suffering we are willing to live next to every single day. Every city eventually becomes what it tolerates. The question isn't whether this architecture of fragility affects all of us. It does. It raises our costs, it degrades our public systems, it normalizes cruelty. The question is how long we pretend it doesn't.